The TLCMs are a very good pedal set for the price, but because the brake is using springs, it doesn't reset back to the position as fast as it can be. With that in mind, and because I've used 3D Wraps mods for other equipment in the past, I decided to try out and buy some of their foams for the TLCM. This one is called the Street Plus Racing because reasons. In this case, depending on which spring you use with this, it might be softer or it might be a little bit harder to press. This one over here, called the Extension, is essentially to connect to the Street Plus Racing and then basically use all of this instead of any springs and just use an elastomer kit. This mod is very simple to install. You just need to remove the springs that you already have, and then you have to make a choice if you're going to install just the tall one or if you're going to install with the short one, which is called the Extension. If you install the tall one, or they're called the Street Plus Racing, you install the long elastomer, put a spring on top of it, then you choose the correct bumper. And then now it's the case that you should, at least on my setup I did, you should install at least a couple of shims. The reason why, if you don't install just a couple of shims, what ends up happening is that you're gonna have a little bit of play in the spring. This also happens if you install the Extension. However, if you install it with the shims, there's not the same type of play. It's far more fixed. This is the setup we're gonna try, and we're also gonna try the Extension and also the black or / gray spring. Currently, I'm using the setup that I like the most, which is the red spring with the tall elastomer, and this is essentially corrects all the shortcomings of the TLCM's brake design, where you can essentially use the stiffer springs, compress them to the max, and the load cell isn't still being fully utilized. So you have zero movement, and you have still about 15 to 20 kilos of force that you can still use on the load cell, which is kind of weird. So this setup essentially corrects that. It's also the setup that they call the racing setup, or whatever it is. And the red spring, in this case, it acts as a very stiff preload, even though the elastomer also moves a bit, and it allows for a very natural movement of the brake, to the point where when I started using, I instantly connected to this. It's super natural for me, coming from a V3, that the V3 doesn't have a preload of this type. It allows for excellent modulation of the brake pedal, and it's far superior to whatever comes in the box. In this case, it kind of feels that you can use all of the force of the load cell, and it's still, the elastomer doesn't compress fully, which is something that I like. It's reliable, it's precise, the elastomer goes back really fast, the stiffest spring acts very naturally, and I think it's a design that is very well thought of. With both elastomers or using the Extension, this one is something that I don't particularly like. It turns the load cell, even at the 100 kilo rating, it turns the load cell into something super sensitive. The brake feel is good, not as good as the CSL, for example, but with the slightest of touch, and it's something that I find fascinating, with far less force, I'm able to overpower the load cell far easily. In this case, there's no preloads, both elastomers are working as a unit, and it becomes quite difficult for me, even using the same setup of car here in ACC, becomes quite difficult for me to brake with the same type of precision, because I always feel that I'm not using that much force, and looking below at the brake, I'm using over 50% of the power already of the brake, when in this case I would be probably using 20 or 30% of the power. Even though this setup is the most expensive out of the bunch because it uses both elastomers, it's the one that I like the least because it's, for me, quite difficult to brake with. I don't really know how much force I need to put, and it's also the one with worst pedal feel. It's not as good as the CSL. The CSL feels more compact, a better rounded elastomer set. This one just feels like you're pressing some sort of foam.
And this is the case where the red spring does an excellent job of balancing everything together as a preload, and also mostly likely as some sort of stabilizing agent with the elastomer as well. It doesn't feel as fast going into the top after pressing it, and in terms of braking, I just not liking it as much. With the setup they call it street, it's a very two-stage type of braking where you can really feel where the spring ends and the elastomer begins. It's kind of uncanny. The racing setup, as they call it, felt much better where the springs worked really well and meshed really well with the elastomer. On this one, it's a two-stage type of braking where it becomes quite difficult for me to brake. But in this case, with the black spring or the gray spring, if you use that, it will be very easily overworked. But if you like to have a clear separation between about 50% of braking and from that point onwards, this could be a very interesting hack or cheat. But for me, I prefer a more uniform braking where it linearly increases the braking force needed and not as sudden as this, as it feels like you are just mashing into something and then you hit a bump stop. Between all of the setups that I've tried, the racing setup, as they call it, the one that I think it's most worthwhile your money, and it's also one of the least expensive ones. It gives you a really good pedal feel. It very well integrates the spring with the elastomer. I didn't like the most expensive version because it felt very strange and very easily to overpower the load cell. I did not understand why. And what they call the street version, it creates a very much two-stage type of pedal that is even more uncanny than on a Logitech G93 pedal set. If you have any experience with this or any other types of mods for the TLCM, leave something in the comments below and tell us what you think of it.